You do not need to download anything. You do not need to click a suspicious attachment. You do not need to enter your credentials into a fake login page or respond to a phishing message. In the most severe category of iPhone attack currently documented by security researchers, you do not need to do anything at all except have your phone turned on and connected to the internet. The attack happens when you visit a website, in some documented cases. It happens when a malicious link is sent to your phone and your messaging application previews it automatically before you have touched it, before you have made any conscious decision to interact with it. Your iPhone processes the content. A vulnerability in the code that handles that content is triggered, and from that moment forward, the attacker has access to your device at a level that Apple's own marketing materials about iPhone security would lead you to believe is impossible. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a theoretical risk described in academic papers that has never been observed in practice. This is a documented real-world attack category that has been confirmed on the devices of journalists, lawyers, activists, business executives, and ordinary people across dozens of countries, verified through forensic analysis by some of the most respected, and acknowledged through emergency patch releases by Apple, itself on timelines that make clear how seriously the company takes these vulnerabilities when they are brought to its attention. To understand how a website visit can compromise an iPhone, you need to understand something about how your phone processes the content of web pages and messages, because the vulnerability is not in Safari itself as a visible application, but in the underlying code libraries that handle SP, specific types of content. When your iPhone loads a web page, it is not simply displaying text and images. It is executing a complex series of parsing and rendering operations across multiple code libraries that handle HTML structure, CSS styling, JavaScript execution, image decoding, video processing, font rendering, and numerous other content types. Each of these libraries represents a body of code, and any body of code of sufficient complexity contains bugs. Most bugs cause crashes or display errors, but a specific category of bug called a memory corruption vulnerability can be triggered by specially crafted content in a way that gives an attacker the ability to execute their own code on your device. When that code runs with the privileges of the browser or the system process handling the content, the attacker gains the ability to read files on your device, access your camera and microphone, extract your messages and emails, retrieve your passwords from your keychain, and install persistent software that survives even if you close the browser and restart your phone. The research organization that has produced the most extensive and most consequential documentation of this attack category against iPhone is Citizen Lab, an interdisciplinary research group based at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Citizen L. These researchers specialize in tracking the use of commercial surveillance technology against civil society targets, and their investigations have repeatedly uncovered active exploitation of browser-based and zero-click iPhone vulnerabilities in real-world targeted attack campaigns. Their 2021 discovery and documentation of what they know that forced entry is the most significant single finding in this category and the one that most clearly demonstrates the real-world severity of the threat. Forced entry was a zero-click exploit, meaning it required absolutely no interaction from target that was delivered through Apple's iMessage platform by exploiting a vulnerability in the way iPhone processed a specific image file format called a PDF embedded within a GIF wrapper. When the malicious file was received by the target's iPhone, the Messages application processed it automatically as part of its preview generation function. The processing triggered a memory corruption vulnerability in the image rendering library. That vulnerability was used to install Pegasus, a commercial spyware product developed by the Israeli company NSO Group, on the target's device. Citizen Lab confirmed forced entry infections on the devices of Bahraini activists and subsequently on devices belonging to journalists, lawyers, and human rights defenders across multiple countries. Apple issued an emergency patch for the underlying vulnerability in September 2021 after Citizen Lab reported their findings, rating it as a critical severity issue. Forced entry was not an isolated case. It was the most technically sophisticated example of a pattern that Citizen Lab, Google's Project Zero vulnerability research team, and Amnesty International's security labs have documented repeatedly across multiple years and multiple distinct vulnerability chains. Google Project Zero, which employs some of the world's leading vulnerability researchers specifically to find and report security flaws before malicious actors exploit them, has published detailed technical analyses of iPhone browser vulnerabilities that could be triggered through web content. Their research has identified vulnerabilities in WebKit, which is the browser engine that powers Safari and that Apple requires all third-party browsers on iPhone to use, that allow malicious web pages to execute arbitrary code on the device visit, them. The requirement that all iOS browsers use WebKit is significant because it means that using Chrome, Firefox, or any other browser on your iPhone does not provide the protection those browsers' own security architectures might offer on other platforms. Every browser on your iPhone uses the same underlying rendering engine, so a WebKit vulnerability affects your device regardless of which browser icon you tap. Amnesty International's security lab conducted forensic analysis of iPhones belonging to journalists and activists who had been targeted with Pegasus spyware and published their methodology and findings in 2021 as part of the Pegasus Project, a coordinated investigation involving 17 media organizations across 10 countries. Their technical findings were independently peer-reviewed by Citizen Lab and confirmed as accurate. The forensic indicators they documented on compromised iPhones included evidence of exploitation through both iMessage zero-click vectors and browser-based one-click vectors, where the target was sent a link that, when visited, triggered the exploit chain. The breadth of the confirmed target list, which included the phones of journalists at major international news organizations, a head of state, Cabinet Masai, ministers in multiple governments, and human rights lawyers, demonstrated that this category of attack was being actively deployed at scale against a wide range of targets, rather than being reserved for the highest value intelligence targets only. The commercial surveillance industry that develops and sells these capabilities is larger and more established than most people realize. NSO Group, the developer of Pegasus, is one of dozens of companies operating in a market that researchers at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace estimated was generating revenues in the billions of dollars annually as of 2023. Companies including Kangaroo, also based in Israel, Fisher, formerly based in Germany, Citrox, formerly operating from North Macedonia, and Inte companies have all been documented deploying browser-based or messaging-based iPhone exploits against real-world targets by Citizen Lab, Google's Threat Analysis Group, or both. The existence of a commercial market MEA suggests that these capabilities are not limited to nation-state intelligence agencies with the resources to develop them internally. They are available to any government, institution, or sufficiently funded private actor willing to pay the licensing fees, which Citizen Lab's investigations have documented ranging from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars per deployment. Apple has responded to this threat category through several mechanisms, and understanding what those mechanisms do and do not protect you from is essential to understanding what actions you can take on your device. The most significant protective mechanism Apple introduced specifically in response to zero-click and one-click browser exploitation is called Lockdown Mode, which was released as part of iOS 16 in 2022. Apple describes Lockdown Mode as an extreme optional protection designed for the very small number of users who, because of who they are or what they do, may be personally targeted by some of the most sophisticated digital threats. When enabled, Lockdown Mode implements a series of restrictions on your iPhone's behavior that specifically target the attack surfaces used in documented exploit chains. It blocks most message attachment types in iMessage, displaying only images in certain common formats while blocking the exotic file types that have been used in zero-click exploits. It blocks JavaScript on websites by default unless you specifically whitelist a site. It blocks wired connections to computers when your PHONE is locked. It disables certain web technologies that have been used in exploit chains. It restricts FaceTime calls from contacts not already in your list. Each of these restrictions directly addresses a documented attack vector used in real confirmed exploitation campaigns. Citizen Lab conducted testing of Lockdown Mode after its release and published findings indicating that the mode successfully blocked the forced entry exploit chain and several related techniques they tested against it. Their assessment was that Lockdown Mode represented a meaningful and genuine security improvement for the highest risk users. The trade-off is functional. Some websites will not load correctly with JavaScript disabled. Some communication features become more restricted. WebAssembly, a technology used by many legitimate web applications, is blocked entirely. Certain fonts used by websites replaced with system defaults. Link previews and messages are disabled. Just-in-time JavaScript compilation, which dramatically accelerates web application performance, but also represents an exploitation surface, is disabled. Each of these restrictions directly targets a technique that has appeared in real documented exploit chains, rather than being theoretical hardening against hypothetical threats. For users who are journalists, lawyers, activists, executives handling sensitive information, or anyone with specific reason to believe they may be personally targeted, Citizen Lab's assessment and Apple's documentation both suggest that Lockdown Mode is worth enabling, despite the functional trade-offs. To enable Lockdown Mode on your iPhone, go into your Settings application, scroll down to Privacy and Security, scroll to the bottom of that section, and tap Lockdown Mode. Read the description Apple provides, tap Turn on Lockdown Mode, and confirm. Our phone will restart and the mode will be active. You can disable it at any time by returning to the same setting. For users who determine that lockdown mode's restrictions are too significant for their daily use PIA turns, there are several individual settings that provide partial protection against browser-based attacks, without the full restrictions lockdown mode imposes. The first and most consistently recommended individual setting is to keep your iPhone updated to the latest available iOS version without delay. Apple's emergency patch response to forced entry was issued within days of Citizen Lab's report, and the company has maintained a pattern of prioritizing rapid patches for actively exploited vulnerabilities. The window between a vulnerability being discovered by an attacker and Apple issuing a patch is the period during which your device is most exposed. The window between Apple issuing a patch and you installing it is the period during which your device remains exposed to a threat T-hat Apple has already fixed. Minimizing that second window by installing updates as soon as they are available is the single most impactful individual action you can take to reduce your exposure to browser-based exploitation. Go into your settings, tap General, tap Software Update, and enable automatic updates for both iOS updates and security responses and system files. The security responses and system files option, introduced in iOS 16, allows Apple to deliver rapid security responses, which are small targeted patches for actively exploited vulnerabilities that can be installed without a full iOS update and without requiring a restart in many cases. The second individual setting to address is Safari's JavaScript behavior for sites you do not trust. Go into your settings, scroll down to Safari, scroll to the bottom and tap Advanced, and then tap JavaScript. Disabling JavaScript globally in Safari is a significant functional trade-off, because most modern websites depend on JavaScript for their core functionality and will not work directly without it. However, if you are visiting a website you do not fully trust, temporarily disabling JavaScript before visiting that site and re-enabling it afterward eliminates the most common browser exploitation vector, since the majority of documented browser exploit chains depend on JavaScript execution to trigger the vulnerability. A middle ground approach is to use Safari's reader mode, AXE, cycle through the AA icon in the address bar on unfamiliar websites, since reader mode strips out JavaScript and most active content and displays only the text and images of the page in a sanitized format. The third protective measure is to treat links received through any messaging platform with explicit caution, since the iMessage zero-click attack vector documented in Force, Dentry, and related campaigns specifically targets the automatic content preview behavior that messaging applications perform when a link or file is received. In iMessage, go into your settings, or to tap Messages and review the options available around message filtering and unknown senders. Enabling Filter Unknown Senders places messages from contacts not in your address book into a separate list and critically disables link previews for those messages, which removes the automatic content processing that zero-click attacks exploit. For messages received through third-party messaging applications, review the settings of each application for options to disable automatic link preview loading or automatic media downloading, since any application that automatically processes content from unknown senders without user interaction represents a potential zero-click attack surface. The fourth measure is to review which applications have been granted access to your microphone, camera, and location, since the end goal of most browser-based iPhone exploits is to access exactly these capabilities. Go into Settings, tap Privacy and Security, and work through camera, microphone, and location services, reviewing every application that has been granted access. Revoke access from any application that does not have a clear and specific functional reason to need it. This does not prevent an exploit from occurring, but it limits the data an attacker can access through a successful exploit that operates within the permission constraints of the compromised process. The landscape of browser-based and zero-click iPhone attacks is one that Apple, security researchers, and the broader security community take with complete seriousness, and it has been taken seriously enough to generate emergency patch releases, coordinated international journalism investigations, testimony before legislative bodies in multiple countries, and export control designations applied to commercial spyware vendors by the United States Department of Commerce. The appropriate response from iPhone users is not panic, but deliberate and informed action. The vast majority of iPhone users will never be targeted by the sophisticated commercial spyware campaigns documented by Citizen Lab and Amnesty International. Those campaigns are expensive to deploy and have historically been focused on high-value targets with specific characteristics. But the vulnerability classes that commercial spyware exploits are the same vulnerability classes that less sophisticated and less expensive attack tools also attempt to exploit, and the protections that guard against the most sophisticated attacks also guard against less sophisticated ones, keeping your iOS sign current, enabling lockdown mode if your risk profile warrants it, enabling automatic updates as a security requirement rather than treating them as an optional convenience, being deliberate and cautious about which links you open and from whom you receive them, and reviewing your application permissions regularly are actions that meaningfully reduce your exposure across the full spectrum of browser-based threats documented against iPhone. The research is real, the exploits are real, and deconfirmed through independent forensic analysis. The patches are real and available right now. What you do with that information starting today is the only variable that remains.